he said, "Thank you for the invitation, because I am so sick of always being invited to talk about terrorism. I have nothing to do with terrorism. I just want to talk about Islam. And thank you for giving me that opportunity." So I think that is the different narrative that we should strive for.
Mujamalah itu jamil, dari jamil itu indah. Jadi mengindahkan, membaguskan hubungan antar manusia itu suatu hal yang wajib, yang perlu. Jadi oleh karena itu tidak ada hubungannya dengan soal akidah, soal keimanan. Mengucapkan selamat hari Natal. Saya bilang dulu waktu saya rektor, saya mengeluarkan itu kartu khusus untuk kawan-kawan saya yang penganut Katolik ataupun Protestan atau Kristen. Selamat hari Natal. No problem. Saya nggak merasa keimanan saya sebagai Muslim berkurang.
Yet they choose Christianity is what willing. So the most important thing you find the God path. Yes, finally you choose Christianity rather than Islam is what willing. You know, it's so kind of mutual understanding between Islam and Christianity in Indonesian history. Okay, that's only to give you some insight. The way our relationship in the longer history of relationship between Muslim and Christianity in Indonesia is more peaceful rather than conflictual one.
When I come to America and I get an introduction around not too many people who can pronounce the word KAJIAN, so very well done. I am very honored and humbled to be here today as well. It is my second time in Indonesia. I grew up in the Netherlands, and of course the Netherlands and Indonesia have a long history, also very often a troubled history as well. And I'm very aware of that, so that's why I'm humbled to be here as well. On behalf of my countrymen, maybe I should apologize for all the things that we have done wrong in this country as well. My first encounter with interfaith dialogue actually stemmed from my study of medieval Christian-Jewish interactions. So that's what I studied for my PhD. I taught on that as well. And after I started working in Grand Rapids with the Kaufman Institute for Interfaith Dialogue, I also became interested in Christian-Muslim relations. Christian-Muslim relations seem to be an even more pressing and important issue in today's politics, especially in America today, than Christian-Jewish interactions. So this is why I am absolutely delighted with this invitation. I hope to learn especially. Of course, I know very little about Islam in Indonesia, and I'm not going to tell you anything about it. I'm here to learn about that, so that's why I'm very looking forward very much to Professor Azra's talk as well. But I'm still learning. I'm exploring the thoughts of thinkers such as Nurcholish Madjid, and that's why I'm so humbled and honored to be here today. And besides, I have been traveling through Indonesia, and I've learned to love Indonesia as well, and learning about the rich culture of Indonesia. Saya cinta Indonesia. So let me start by telling you a story from the Middle Ages. Christian-Muslim encounters in the Middle Ages were dominated by mutual suspicion, hostility, and violence. Of course, most of the violence in this period was initiated by Christians. It was almost exactly 800 years today that it was in 1219 that the French Crusaders in Egypt were joined by a remarkable figure. It was a holy man, Saint Francis, who already had gained many followers in his way of following Christ through a life of strict poverty. Saint Francis asked the troops for permission that he could cross the enemy lines and go behind the enemy lines in order to have an audience with the Muslim Sultan, Al-Kamil. And somehow he managed to get to the Sultan's court, where he delivered a sermon. The Sultan, according to the story, listened very intently to this sermon and was amazed at the sincerity of this man. After listening patiently, and he gave Francis a military escort back to the Crusader camp. Now, why is this encounter so significant? I think because it was so completely different from the normal encounters between Muslims and Christians at the time. It was not through violence and weapons, it was with words and a sermon. What motivated Francis to go and preach to the Sultan? We don't quite know. But I suspect that he was maybe not expecting to survive the event. Maybe he was even looking for martyrdom. Maybe he was expecting that if he preached Jesus Christ to the Muslim Sultan, that for sure he would be brought to death. Of course, nothing like that happened. Because what he called the unbelieving Saracens, they were in fact quite friendly, and they were quite willing to listen to him. Of course, we have to give Francis credit for the idea that he should approach these Saracens not with a sword and with violence, but with words. Words of love, God's love for his creatures, and God's love of mankind. Well, Francis was probably very surprised that the Sultan was interested in his preaching. But he shouldn't have been surprised, because the Sultan would probably, normally, as sultans at the time did, spend his time listening to holy men narrating and telling hadiths to him. And Jesus was figured prominently in the Quran and in the hadith. And Al-Kamil was probably eager to listen to stories about Jesus, who is, of course, a venerated figure in the Muslim tradition. In fact, St. Francis's emphasis on Jesus' asceticism and poverty must have met his approval. What probably surprised Al-Kamil was that this Faranj, as Middle Eastern Muslims called the Westerners, Franks, Faranj, did not come carrying a sword, but words of love of Jesus and God. So I think that after this unique episode, after Francis went back to Italy, and I think that both Francis and Al-Kamil were changed. They were both surprised, challenged in their perceptions of the other, challenged in their views of each other's, but also challenged in each other's faith. Let me skip to today. The narrative that today dominates much of America, and indeed the internet, is that Islam leads to terrorism and violence. It says that we are living in a clash of civilizations. And sometimes acts of courage are needed to break through these narratives. It is in personal encounters, human to human, that these narratives can be challenged. And this makes me especially grateful for this invitation to speak here. First of all, full disclosure, I am not a specialist on Islam, least of all on Islam in Indonesia. I'm still learning about this. and this is why I will more talk about interfaith dialogue in general today. And in fact, I will start out with an example of Jewish-Christian encounters rather than Jewish-Muslim encounters. I will mainly talk about the idea of interfaith dialogue itself and how we should engage in such dialogue. So please forgive me if I bring up examples from Jewish-Christian encounters, but I think we can still learn from Jewish-Christian encounters and see how interfaith dialogue should be done. What it is and what it not is, and what it should be. So let me tell you something about the position of Jews in medieval Europe. It was a precarious position. They were a religious minority in a world that was dominated by the Christian church. They were rich and prosperous, but they were also discriminated against and not allowed to own land. Many Jews resorted instead by borrowing money. They were rich, didn't have land, so they had plenty of money, so what can you do? You can lend money and make money with interest. So when Europe went through a period of economic expansion in the 12th century, this was a great economic opportunity for them. Many of the Jews became rich, even became influential at the court of the king, who was, of course, dependent on their services as bankers. But their influential position also caused resentment. At the time that the church was trying to establish a stronger hold on the people, it was a period of increased evangelization and growing Christian self-confidence. Jews sometimes had it hard. Pressure grew on the Jews to convert or risk expulsion from Christian lands. In the long term, the story did not end well for the Jews because they were expelled from England in 1290, from France in the mid-1300s, and from Spain and Portugal by the end of the 15th century. It is in this period of tension that a number of disputations between Christians and Jews were organized, often by the king as a neutral party. Ostensibly, the purpose was to give Jews and Christians an equal opportunity to prove their point, to see who was right, Jews or Christians. The most important one of these disputations was held in Barcelona in 1263. I think that the Jews were aware what was at stake here. They had to deal with restrictions that were imposed on them that limited their ability to really make their case. And of course they had to fear backlash if they actually did make their case. So the rabbi who was to lead the disputation for the Jewish point of view, he said, well, it's a little bit like a disputation between a cat and a mouse. Because the mouse does not know what to fear most, whether to win the disputation or to lose the disputation. At the end, he is going to be eaten by the cat anyway. The Christian side in the Barcelona disputation was held by a Dominican friar, Pablo Cristiani, who was praised for his intimate knowledge of Judaism. Well, actually, he was a convert from Judaism to Christianity. And he was instructed by one of the most learned polemicists of his age, a Dominican friar called Raymond de Peñaforte. This school of Dominicans was setting up academies for learning Hebrew and even Arabic. They were part of a larger effort by the church at the time to convert both Jews and Muslims to Christianity. And part of the strategy was to study the languages and culture and religion of these other religions in the hope of converting these people. So part of the argument of Pablo Cristiani was that the Jewish scriptures themselves, the Torah and even the Talmud, all pointed to the coming of the Messiah, his death and his suffering and resurrection. So the point of Pablo Christiani was that if the Jews only read their own scripture, they would know that Jesus was the Messiah, and they would become Christians. Needless to say, Jews were not very impressed by these arguments. If anything, it shows that dialogue and disputation is not always the same thing. In fact, it is quite different things. In order to have a real dialogue, disputation is very often the wrong method. Because what Christians saw as the serious study of Judaism, Jews saw as an attempt at appropriation, trying to take Judaism and their scriptures away from them. Because the Christians said, if you Jews would understand your own religion, you would convert to Christianity. So, often in these medieval disputations, that was the purpose. The intellectual takeover was combined with a political pressure. Right? Interfaith dialogue is a field where many things go wrong very easily. It is a very subtle, it's a very difficult field. You can make many mistakes. And it is sad to say that Christians in the Middle Ages were making every mistake they possibly could. However, not everything was bleak and bad in the Middle Ages. Let me take you back another 100 years before 1263 to about 1160, to the city of Paris. Paris was home to a Jewish congregation, a very influential and lively Jewish congregation that engaged in a new approach to the study of the Bible. And rather than using the Bible as a source of allegory, which was common at the time, Jews were discovering, or maybe even for the first time inventing, the method of linguistic philology for better understanding what the Bible actually said. This was probably driven by a reason. They wanted to defend themselves against Christianity as well, because Christians all the time were allegorizing the Bible in order to read in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the prediction of Christ. And Jews were trying to say, well, you have to look at the literal sense, look at the text, and you will see that Christ is not even mentioned in the Old Testament. Not in its literal sense. Well, for Christians, on the other hand, they were quite interested in this method of linguistic philology, because the Bible they were working with was not in Hebrew, but in Latin. It was a translation made by Jerome in about 400 AD. By 1160, the Latin that was used so many ages before was hard to understand. It was an archaic language. Besides, it was copied many times by scribes, so it was hard to understand and was probably full of mistakes as well. What was needed for Christians was a new approach to really understand what the Bible said. And they found it by looking at the Hebrew text. But for the Hebrew text, they needed help from the Jews who had the Hebrew text. So in a monastery near Paris, outside the city walls, a monastery called Saint Victor, there was a canon, kind of monk, by the name of Andrew, who was working his way through the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah, many Christians, of course, read the book of Isaiah as a prediction of the coming of Jesus. Needless to say, Jews didn't see it that way. They read it in a different way. Well, Christians said, well, maybe the Jews, they don't know how to read their own scripture. But still, Andrew was encountering many difficulties in commenting and reading Isaiah, he needed help from the local Jews to say, what does it say in your text? What does it say in the Hebrew? Can you explain this to me? So Andrew needed the help of the Jews, and he was ready to set aside religious differences, to just go to the local synagogue to learn what they had to say about their text. And it led him to write a completely different type of commentary, a philological, linguistic commentary based on the literal sense. And in doing that, he created a new kind of commentary. In fact, he invented biblical studies in the modern sense of the word. In the long run, it would have huge influence on the later Reformation in Christianity as well. The new interest in the Bible that he created. Of course, Andrew's work was not without problems, because many of the Christians in his own monastery said, why are you going to the Jews? That's dangerous. Before you know it, you're going to mix Judaism and Christianity. You can't do that. That is heresy. They call it Judaizing, and that's a bad accusation. Thankfully, by the time that many people started to criticize him, Andrew had already moved away to a faraway monastery in England, where he became an abbot and lived we actually don't have a record of him after that, but we assume that he lived a long and happy life after that. So we don't even know how he reacted to these accusations. But if we think about it, even for Andrew himself, the exploration of the Jewish traditions must have been sometimes troubling to him. It must have caused him some discomfort to know that, yes, these Jews were the best specialists on biblical studies you could get, but he also had different beliefs. They didn't quite understand the Bible exactly the way that Andrew did. And that is, the Jews were arguing that the Christians were really wrong in their interpretation of Isaiah. And that's confrontation. So Andrew, I think, was not only picking up learning, he was also challenged in his faith as well. On the other hand, Andrew sometimes was also clearly impressed by the Jews that he encountered. One thing, in his commentary, he writes about the Sabbath. And he says, the Jews, they really keep the Sabbath in a really good way. They don't do any work. They don't do even any money transactions. He said, if only we Christians could do it this seriously as well. He was clearly a little bit jealous of how well the Jews were keeping to their own tradition. And I think that kind of jealousy is a positive sign. It's a sign of appreciation for the other. And I think if dialogue can lead to this, I have a friend at the Kaufman Institute who calls it holy jealousy. And I think that's good. It doesn't mean that you have to take it over or convert. It just says, you guys do that really well. Oh, I wish we had that too. And I think that's a nice sign of mutual appreciation. So I think that interfaith dialogue, there are two different narratives, two different stories in the Middle Ages. There's the story of disputation and confrontation, but also the story of humble learning. So thank you for humoring me in this historical excursion. Now the question is, what can we learn from this? Well, first of all, I think it shows that, as I said, you can make many mistakes in religious dialogue. And we can thankfully learn from the mistakes that Christians made in interfaith dialogue in the Middle Ages. So, the disputation of 1263, the Barcelona disputation, shows that disputation is not the same as dialogue. Where did it go wrong? Well, first of all, Christians claimed that they understood Jewish scriptures better than the Jews themselves. They tried to delegitimize the Jews' own reading of their sacred texts. And sadly, we can see the same thing very often happen in Christian-Muslim relations as well. We can hear sometimes, alas, Muslims argue that the Gospels that Christians read are a corrupted version of the Gospels. On the other hand, Christians also say, well, the Quran completely misunderstands the Bible. Well, who are we to say, well, we understand the Quran better than the Muslims do, right? That's not a way of really reading the other scripture in a legitimate way. So arguments like that do not lead to dialogue, but only to anger and resentment. And second, think about the dialogue between the cat and the mouse. I think the Jewish rabbi was really right in casting himself as the mouse, disputing with the cat. Sooner or later he would be eaten. The question is only how long will the cat play with the mouse before he eats it. So rather than looking for a winner in a debate, Christians and Muslims should be prepared to address the injustice that underlies the power imbalance that still is characterizing many interfaith dialogue. So the disputation in Barcelona was motivated not by a desire to listen and learn, but to force conversion and to cite the Quran. If I may, as a Christian, cite the Quran, there is no compulsion in religion. The principle is valid for Christians too, of course. And sadly, both groups are sometimes forgetting that point. Real dialogue should be based on mutual respect. While Christians were trying to convert the Jews in this disputation, of course the opposite, the idea of a Jew converting a Christian, would have been horrible to them. Well, I think Christians sometimes forget the golden rule, the words of Jesus, that says, do unto others as you wish others to do unto you. So, if you want to wish to convert others, you must be also prepared for others to convert you. That's the golden rule. So I think we can learn more from Andrew of St. Victor's willingness to learn from other religions, his willingness to listen, to set aside judgment, and to use another religion to gain insight into his own. That's quite unique in the medieval period. And I think part of what made it possible is the fact that these contacts were personal and not institutional. Andrew had real friends in the Jewish community that he consulted. And as friends, they were ready to discuss, maybe do some bantering, but I think they were probably also eating together and celebrating their friendship together. So when interfaith dialogue is guided by the practice of friendship and indeed hospitality, as we are experiencing here today, I think that then interfaith dialogue has more of a chance of succeeding than when it is guided by official declarations prepared by heavyweight theologians. When you share bread, dialogue can follow. At the same time, of course, dialogue can be troubling too. Serious dialogue does not leave us untouched. It reaches sometimes to the core of what we really believe, and it has the power to change us radically. And change is never comfortable. I think Andrew experienced some of this discomfort as well. But interfaith dialogue does not mean giving up your own beliefs or combining beliefs in syncretism. No, I think in order to do true interfaith dialogue, you have to be true to your own self as well. And you can only dialogue if you are open about your own beliefs and firm in your own beliefs as well. It leads to a better dialogue. So it is a great misunderstanding that interfaith dialogue leads to syncretism. No? And I think Andrew of St. Victor experienced that when he was accused of Judaizing. Some conservative Christians in America accuse Christians who engage in Christian-Muslim dialogue also of becoming half-Muslims. I don't think they are becoming half-Muslims, they are simply becoming better Christians. So what is needed, I think, is a change in the narrative of Christian-Muslim relations. In America, maybe in the world. The narrative of the clash of civilizations, I think, should be dispelled. Instead, we should acknowledge and discover common religious roots. In my mind, there is no doubt that Christians and Muslims are worshipping the same God. But, regrettably, sometimes they are worshipping the same false gods, too. I'm thinking of the gods of violence and greed. I think when we turn on the news, we can see those false gods in full display. The gods of violence and greed. Well, I think Christians and Muslims are not rivals. Instead, they should be allies and partners in identifying these gods as false gods and calling on people to the worship of the one true God who commands love and justice, love of God and neighbor. So, as I said, I think we need a new story, a new narrative. What would it look like? Well, I'm very hopeful here. In my own work with the Kaufman Institute in Grand Rapids, which is maybe a small, insignificant city. I bet you that nobody here has ever even heard of the city of Grand Rapids, with the exception maybe of a few graduates of Calvin College that I know are in the audience here, or Calvin Seminary. The Kaufman Institute called a few years ago for a year of interfaith dialogue, which was a great success. But interfaith dialogue, alas, it drew an audience of mainly older people who were quite happy to talk about matters of faith. And there was a problem, because you don't want to just have a nice two old people sitting around and having a cup of coffee together and talk about common religious experiences. You want to engage young people as well. The year after that, the Kaufman Institute called for a year of interfaith service. The idea comes from Ebu Patel, who is an Indian-born American Muslim who founded the Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago in 2002. So, in the year of interfaith service, suddenly Christian communities who normally would never engage in interfaith dialogue because they thought it was heresy, they were quite willing to work together with the local mosque in cleaning up the local river, fighting pollution, fighting poverty, and starting a soup kitchen. Because together, God calls us to these acts of love and justice. Out of this interfaith service year came a year, the next year was called the Year of Interfaith Friendship. Because these Christians and Muslims who had started to work together, they started to form friendships and eat together. So these friendship groups are now flourishing in Grand Rapids thanks to the Year of Interfaith Dialogue, Interfaith Service, and Interfaith Friendship as well. And I think, okay, thank you. That stands at the heart of this new narrative. So it is my hope that in this small way we can change the story, change the narrative, change the narrative of Christian-Muslim relations as well. And that is why I am so grateful for the invitation here today. I think that what the Nurcholish Madjid Institute is doing, I think Christians in America should hear about this and learn about it, because it's a different story from what they hear in the news every day. If I can, one more little story. the imam of the Bosnian mosque in Grand Rapids. There's a Bosnian minority there with a mosque. And I invited him to an interfaith event at Calvin University. And he said, "Thank you for the invitation, because I am so sick of always being invited to talk about terrorism. I have nothing to do with terrorism. I just want to talk about Islam. And thank you for giving me that opportunity." So I think that is the different narrative that we should strive for. Thank you very much.